Morning after. Robert awoke at first light. He lay there for a moment to get his bearings. He turned his head and caught a glimpse of Rebecca's flaming red hair in the morning light. Ah, yes. Rebecca. He thought to himself. Now he knew where he was. This was Rebecca's bed. His mind quickly caught up. He had called in on Rebecca after work and never made it home. He had been charmed by her flowing red locks and her hot little Irish body. They had chatted and sipped on Baileys until they were sure that Rebecca's daughter was asleep, then fucked like rabbits until after 2. Robert rose slowly and staggered to the toilet for a pee. Not wanting to wake his partner, he tried to be silent, even sitting so that his falling piss would not make a sound. He stood up, and still in a stupor, flushed the toilet as he left. Stupid. He cursed himself under his breath. He need not have worried. When he returned to the bed, Rebecca had not stirred. They had fucked for hours and she was, quite literally, rooted. He stood for a moment admiring the curve of her ass under the sheet before he slowly lowered himself into the bed beside her. He covered himself with just the sheet, prepared to nap for a few more hours. A minute or two passed as he lay there thinking of the lovely MILF laying beside him. Her skin was china white and lightly freckled. She would be 30 soon but still had the body of an 18-year-old. Robert was drifting off when he heard the slight creak of the bedroom door. He opened his eyes to see Monica standing at the foot of the bed. He looked up at her and quickly raised one finger to his lips as a signal to request her silence. She tiptoed to the bed and knelt so that her face was just inches from his. He made the sign with his finger again, then motioned for her to come closer. She turned her head so that he could whisper in her ear. Mommy was up really late. Don't wake her, he cautioned. Robert could see that Monica wanted to reply, so turned his head so that she could whisper in the ear away from Rebecca. I heard the toilet and thought I might sneak into bed for a cuddle. She paused for a second then continued, Can I have a cuddle with you? She backed away and turned her ear to him again, waiting for a reply. He thought for a moment before he spoke. I'm naked. I don't. She turned her head and cut him off before he could finish his sentence. She didn't wait for him to turn his ear to her. That's okay. Let me in. She whispered straight to his face. She stood up quickly and then to Robert's surprise she stripped off her nighty. She stood before him, skinny and near naked except for a pair of cute white cotton panties. Her skin was a little darker than her mother's, but she sported the same flaming red locks. Robert shuffled back away from the edge of the bed to make room for his new partner then pulled back the sheet to let her in. He had exposed his penis and she paused for a while to look at the fat red slug between his legs. She slid in beside him in one agile movement and laid her head on his waiting arm, her face just an inch from his. He covered her with the sheet and placed his palm on the flat of her tiny back and pulled her close. Rebecca had not stirred. Monica thought she would get straight to the point. Did you and Mommy have sex last night? She whispered. Monica. Oh, it's okay. Last time you stayed the night I kept asking Mom what you were doing, and she eventually told me. It is hard to convey a tone of voice when you whisper, but Robert quickly got the message. Then yes, we had sex last night. That is why your mom is so tired. We had lots of sex last night. Goody. I really like you, and if you and Mommy have lots of sex maybe we can live together. Robert was, at the same time, pleased that Monica liked him and a little saddened that she was so desperate to have a man around the house. He leaned forward and kissed her gently and started rubbing her back. She had been lying completely straight but now tucked her knees up so that her shins were pressed into his thighs. Without meaning it she had squashed his penis into an odd angle. With his free hand he extracted it and laid it through the gap between her knees. Oh, it's nice and warm. She whispered, and again she paused. Can I touch it? I suppose so. What would your mother say? She probably wouldn't mind, but she doesn't really need to know. Monica didn't wait for an answer. Robert felt as her tiny fingers started stroking his tool. She squeezed it in a few places and slid the foreskin back and forward a little. She took particular interest in the head, feeling the narrowing at its base and the hole at the end. It started to grow in her hands. It's getting bigger? That's because you are touching it. If you keep going it will get really big and go hard. Monica was getting a little bolder. Instead of just squeezing with finger and thumb she took his cock and squeezed it with all of her hand. And sure enough, as Robert had predicted, the cock grew larger and harder within her grasp. I want to see it. She whispered to him. Robert gently pulled back the sheet to reveal his swollen member. Monica looked down at the rod emerging from between her knees. I'm going down for a closer look, and before he could answer she had straightened her legs and was gently wiggling down the bed. Before long her face was level with his erect cock and just inches away from its swollen head. She had extracted her lower arm and was now holding the shaft with 2 hands. She squeezed it from end to end and inspected all sides. She even reached in and felt his hairy scrotum and rock-hard nuts. He had been laying on his side for some time and needed to adjust his body a little. As he squirmed, the wet head of his cock pushed against her cheek, smearing his juice across the side of her face. She wiped it off with the back of her hand. Robert watched as she tried to work out what to do next. After a second she dried it on the sheet. Feeling playful, he rolled forward a little and pushed the head of his cock against the young girl's lips. Instead of wiping the juice off, she licked her lips and tasted man for the very first time. Robert thought he would try again, expecting her to push his cock to the side. He rolled forward and pressed his head against her lips once more. To his great surprise she didn't push him away. Instead she opened her lips and took his wet head into her warm moist mouth. She used her grip on his shaft to pull herself toward him, and as she did so a large blob of his juice oozed onto her tongue. It was Robert who pulled away. He looked down at her, expecting a look of shock or disdain. Instead she looked up at him and smiled broadly, both hands still clamped around his rock-hard cock. This time it was she who moved. She grabbed his member harder and pulled her face toward him, her mouth wrapping around his head. She pumped his cock a few times, milking his juice into her mouth, her tongue darting around his head. He could feel the tip of her tongue exploring the hole in the center, the source of the magic juice. She broke away and looked up at him again, but only long enough to shoot out one whispered word. Yum. She kept working away at his cock, and he knew that if she kept going she would get a surprise mouthful in a few minutes. He tapped her on the head. When she broke away and looked up at him, he motioned for her to come to him. Reluctantly she wiggled up until her face was level with his, her lips and cheeks wet with his juice. Do you want me to stop? She questioned quietly. No, but if you keep going you are going to get a surprise. My penis will squirt a mouthful of juice all at once. That's okay. Will you know when it will happen? Sure. If you want to keep going I can warn you just before it squirts. Okay? Great. One more thing, there is nowhere you can spit it out. You'll have to swallow it. Okay. With that, the young girl wiggled back to her position in front of his cock and started sucking again. Robert reached down and cradled her hands for a while to train her in the best rhythm. Soon she was pumping his cock as skillfully as her mother had done the night before. Monica's mouth was much smaller than Rebecca's, so she couldn't go down on him, but she made up for it with her hands. A few minutes later he was ready to blow. He tapped on her head and he felt her lips tighten around the base of his head. A few more pumps with her hands, and wham, the young girl had her first mouthful of cum. She kept pumping until he reached across and held her hand still. He milked his cock a few times, then pulled it to the side and out of her mouth. Slowly she wiggled back up and lay her head on his arm once more. Her lip and cheeks were still wet. He wiped her face with a sheet and covered them both. This time she was laying on her back. He leaned forward and whispered in her ear, "That was great." She just nodded. With his free hand he started rubbing her tight flat stomach. He slid his hand down over her hips and rubbed her thighs. She moved her legs in response, spreading her knees, with her feet touching. Robert stroked her inner thighs up to her panties, then returned to rub her skinny flat chest. He leaned in again and whispered, "How old are you?" 11, 12 in a few months. He continued rubbing her chest, feeling her hard little nipples. They were tight and erect on her flat chest, with no breast at all. He wondered how long before they started to grow. He slid his hand lower and decided to include her panties in his ministrations. He laid his hand on her vulva with his fingers over her vagina and slowly massaged the little girl's cunt. It wasn't long before she started to purr. He rubbed her thighs again, but this time he didn't stop at her panties. He was rubbing her vulva again when he felt her tiny hand. He stopped rubbing and she took hold of his wrist, moving his hand up to her stomach. He thought she wanted him to stay away from her pussy until he felt her start to push his hand back down. She had lifted the elastic of her panties and his hand slid inside, onto her soft hairless skin. She let go once his hand was wedged inside the front of her panties. Robert didn't need a second invite. He slid his hand down until his fingers were touching the soft skin of her tiny labia. With his first and third fingers on either side, he pressed his largest finger deep into her tiny crack. He felt the mouth of her vagina with his fingertip, and to his surprise it was wet. He had thought that, As she had not even started puberty, she would not make her own juice. He was wrong. He rubbed his finger back and forward along her crack, hoping that the friction would get more juice flowing. It did. When he checked her vagina again, it was a little wetter. He bent his finger and slid the first joint inside. Her cunt was tiny and tight. He massaged her a little, then pulled his finger back out. He was afraid he might hurt her or, worse still, make her bleed more. He slid his finger inside her again, this time to the second joint. God, she was tight. He pumped his finger just the short distance between first and second joint, but this time he kept going. After a while he noticed that he was using all of his finger, with the fingers on either side being the only things stopping him from going any deeper. He listened to her breathing. She was really enjoying this. He wasn't sure whether she could reach orgasm at her age. He just kept going. He never found out. Behind him, he could hear Rebecca staring to stir. He slid his finger from Monica's tiny cunt and whispered in her ear, "Enough for now. Mommy is waking up." Monica watched as Robert pulled his hand from under the sheets and slowly licked his finger clean. HMMMM. 11-year-old cunt tasted good. Monica leaned forward and gave Robert a big hug and many kisses.